The town of Crescent Hollow was small, tight-knit, and peaceful, until the day tragedy struck. In the span of just a few hours, Sarah Green, a beloved mother, and her two young 10-year-old twin boys, Eli and Noah, tragically passed away, leaving the entire town in shock. It seemed impossible. A healthy mother and her children, all gone in one tragic moment. The cause was unknown. No one could understand how something so devastating could happen to one family in one day. The entire community was rocked to its core. It was a typical spring morning when the unthinkable happened. Sarah, an outgoing and caring mother, had been found unresponsive at home by her husband, Jacob Green. Despite attempts to revive her, Sarah was pronounced dead shortly after paramedics arrived. Shocked and devastated, the family was left trying to comprehend the sudden loss. As if that wasn't enough heartbreak, only a few hours later, little Eli and Noah, who had been playing in their bedroom, collapsed in their room. Despite all efforts to revive them, both children were declared dead before they could even make it to the hospital. The town was left reeling with grief. The entire community was trying to come to terms with how such a beautiful, close-knit family could have been taken from them so suddenly. The funeral service took place just days later. Family, friends, and even strangers filled the small church in Crescent Hollow, paying their respects to Sarah and her two young children. Everyone was numb with grief, unable to fathom the magnitude of the loss. Jacob Green, Sarah's husband, stood by the casket, surrounded by friends and relatives who tried to comfort him. His face was a blank mask of sorrow, his eyes hollow, as though he had lost a piece of himself that could never be replaced. As the service progressed, the heavy atmosphere weighed down on everyone. But then, as the mourners began to leave and say their final goodbyes, one detail caught everyone by surprise. A single white rose appeared on the casket. But it wasn't just any rose. It was placed neatly on top of Sarah's, Eli's, and Noah's shared casket. No one knew who had placed it there, or how it had come to be. But it wasn't until a quiet whisper spread among the mourners that the real shock came. Jacob Green, broken and silent, turned and looked at the casket, his eyes locking onto the rose. His hands trembled as he reached for it. As the mourners looked on, some noticed that the rose seemed to shimmer, almost glowing softly in the dim light of the church. The whispers began to spread like wildfire. Was this a sign? Was it the work of someone from beyond the grave? But as Jacob held the rose, a strange calm washed over him. He closed his eyes, almost as if listening to something only he could hear. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the whole world was holding its breath. And then Jacob, eyes still closed, murmured something inaudible, almost like a prayer, before placing the rose back on the casket. The entire church went silent. No one could speak. It was as though a collective gasp had been taken by every single person in the room. The mood shifted. Fear, confusion, and awe hung thick in the air. It was as if the very fabric of reality had shifted for just an instant, and no one quite knew what to make of it. The unknown rose, and the strange moment Jacob had just shared with it, had opened a door no one could have expected. It was as if something far beyond their understanding had just brushed up against them. But what was it? Was it a message from the afterlife? A sign from the children and their mother? Or something darker? Whatever it was clear that the story of Sarah, Eli, and Noah was far from over. The days following the funeral were an eerie blur for Jacob Green. His life had been turned upside down, his entire world shattered, and now he was left to navigate through the pieces of a reality he couldn't understand. The rose, the one that had mysteriously appeared on the casket, continued to haunt him. He couldn't shake the strange feeling it had left him with, nor could he explain the calmness that had taken over him when he had touched it. Despite his grief, Jacob found himself returning to the church, drawn inexplicably to the spot where Sarah, Eli, and Noah had been laid to rest. Every day, without fail, he would stand by the grave, staring at the spot where they were buried, as if waiting for something, anything to happen. The people of Crescent Hollow noticed his odd behavior, but none dared approach him. He was grieving in his own way, and no one wanted to disturb that. But the mystery surrounding the rose lingered. The townspeople couldn't stop talking about it. Who had placed the rose there? How had it been so perfect, so pristine? Despite the heavy rains that had fallen the night before, it didn't make sense. Some claimed to have seen a strange figure standing near the gravesite just before the rose appeared. Others swore they heard whispers in the wind, murmurs that seemed to call out to them, though they could never quite make out the words. One evening, as Jacob stood by the grave, something caught his eye, a movement from the corner of his vision. He turned sharply but saw nothing. Still, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The familiar stillness that had plagued the cemetery since the deaths of his family felt unnatural. Jacob reached down, brushing his fingers along the earth, hoping for a sense of closeness, a sign that they were at peace. That's when it happened. The ground beneath his fingers shifted slightly. At first it was imperceptible, like a small tremor, but then it happened again, this time with more force. The soil at the top of the grave began to stir, and Jacob pulled his hand back instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped back, staring down at the grave in disbelief. Was it possible? Could something be moving beneath the surface? His pulse quickened as he crouched, his eyes scanning the earth. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a faint, glowing light coming from beneath the dirt, like a soft flicker that couldn't be explained by the moonlight. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, or if his grief was simply playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he felt an undeniable pull to the spot. The urge to dig, to unearth whatever secret had been hidden there, was overwhelming. He stood up slowly and looked around. The cemetery was empty, the wind still, but the air around him was charged, crackling with an unseen energy, as if something ancient was awakening. A force was at work here, something far beyond his understanding. The whispers in the wind grew louder. Was it them? Was it Sarah? Eli? Noah? Jacob wasn't sure, but the voices felt close, so close that he could almost hear their names being whispered on the breeze. Jacob! The whisper came again, so faint that it was almost inaudible. But he knew deep in his heart that it wasn't his imagination. It was them. They were reaching out. I have to know the truth, Jacob muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. What happened? What's going on? I have to understand. Without thinking, Jacob dropped to his knees. His hands trembled as he began to scoop the dirt away from the grave, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the deeper he dug, the more the strange energy around him seemed to intensify. The earth beneath his fingers was unnaturally warm, as though it were alive. Suddenly, his hand struck something hard again, this time with a distinct clink as his fingers brushed against what felt like metal. His heart skipped a beat. He pulled the object from the earth, brushing away the remaining dirt, and held it up to the light. It was a small silver locket, old, tarnished, and unmistakably out of place. There was no doubt it had been buried with Sarah, Eli, and Noah. But how had it ended up here, buried beneath the grave? Jacob's hands shook as he opened the locket, revealing a tiny photograph of Sarah, Eli, and Noah, their faces serene, as though posing for a family portrait. But something was off about the image. The photo appeared distorted, almost faded, like it was frozen in time. As Jacob studied the photograph, his pulse raced, and the voices in the wind grew louder still. Was it them? Was it Sarah? Was she trying to tell him something? Or was there something more to this picture than met the eye? Jacob turned the locket over and saw an engraving on the back, worn but still legible. It read, "Bound by love, freed by truth." A chill ran down Jacob's spine. What did it mean? And just as suddenly as it had begun, the earth trembled again, and the locket slipped from Jacob's hand, disappearing into the soil. The ground seemed to swallow it up as if it had never been there. Jacob stumbled back, his heart racing. Something far more than just grief had stirred in this cemetery, something darker. And now it seemed that whatever had been buried here, the truth, was finally ready to be uncovered. Jacob's mind raced, and his breath became erratic. He was still kneeling in the cemetery, the soil around him damp and cold. His hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached for the spot where the locket had vanished. He had to be certain that he hadn't imagined it. That strange object, the shimmering glow, the distorted photograph. It was real. The silence around him felt oppressive, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Jacob could hear the wind whistling through the trees, but it wasn't the comforting breeze he had known. It felt cold, almost unnatural. His pulse thudded in his ears as he rose to his feet, trying to gather his bearings. "What does it mean?" Jacob whispered to himself, still trying to make sense of everything. The curse, the voices, the locket, it was all too much for him to process. How had his life come to this? What had Sarah done? What had been buried with her, Eli and Noah? Jacob's gaze turned back to the gravesite. The ground was disturbed, but the hole was already beginning to fill in, as if the earth itself was trying to cover up what he had uncovered. It felt like something was actively trying to keep the truth buried. As he stood there, Jacob noticed something peculiar, a shadow. It wasn't just the reflection of the trees or the evening light. The shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, shifting like a living thing, creeping toward him. For a moment, Jacob froze. He was no longer alone. Something was there, in the cemetery with him. "Jacob," the voice echoed again, soft but unmistakable. It was Sarah's voice, but this time it wasn't just in the wind. It felt as though the air around him was thick with her presence. He glanced around in a panic, but the cemetery was still empty, the grave silent and still. "Jacob, you have to listen to me." The voice sounded closer now. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel her like she was standing right behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. His heart raced, panic surging through his chest. He knew with chilling certainty that the supernatural force surrounding the gravesite wasn't just connected to Sarah. It was connected to him, too. "The truth will find you, Jacob." The voice was almost whispering, but there was a tone of urgency now, one that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Jacob turned away from the grave, his eyes darting to the surrounding trees, as though expecting something to jump out at him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate, a low hum spreading up his legs. Jacob's entire body stiffened as he slowly crouched down to the earth again. Was the grave trying to speak to him? Could this be Sarah, or was it something else altogether? Something far darker, something that had been buried with them all these years. Suddenly the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. It wasn't just the evening chill now. It was something unnatural, a bite in the air that shouldn't be there. Jacob could feel his breath turning into fog, and for a moment the cemetery looked different, like it was shifting, the shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, as if something was about to materialize in front of him. Without thinking, Jacob grabbed the shovel he had used earlier and began to dig, desperate to uncover the truth. His hands trembled as he forced the tool into the soil, but the ground beneath him felt different now, as though it was resisting. He could feel it, the weight of something ancient, something that had been buried intentionally. Every time he pulled up a handful of dirt, it seemed to sink back into place, as if trying to hide whatever lay beneath. It felt like the earth was alive, fighting against him, trying to keep its secrets. But Jacob wasn't going to stop. He couldn't, not now. With renewed determination, he dug deeper, and that's when he found it. A small, iron-bound chest. Its edges were weathered, but it was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. It was perfectly preserved, though buried deep beneath the grave. It was sealed tight with a rusted lock that seemed to be almost alive, as though the very metal was humming with an energy Jacob couldn't quite understand. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. What was this? Why had it been hidden here, beneath his family's grave? His hands shook as he ran his fingers over the chest, feeling the strange warmth emanating from it. He knew deep down that he was about to uncover something far darker than he had ever imagined. Without hesitation, Jacob yanked the lock open. The sound was sharp, like an ancient door creaking open for the first time in centuries. When the chest finally opened, Jacob stared at the contents, frozen in shock. Inside there was a small bundle of letters, old and yellowed with time. But what caught his attention more than anything was the small, glass vial resting on top of the pile of letters. The vial was filled with a dark liquid that shimmered strangely in the fading light. But the most unsettling part was the symbol engraved into the glass, a symbol that Jacob recognized from the strange carvings on the locket. It was the same symbol that had appeared in his dreams, a circle, broken in half, with lines stretching out in all directions, like the spokes of a wheel. The letters were folded carefully, and they too had a strange, unmistakable energy about them. But it was the vial that unnerved him the most. He could feel it pulsing, a silent thrum that echoed in his chest. A whisper filled the air again, louder this time. "The truth is in your hands, Jacob. The curse will claim you, unless you choose." Jacob's pulse quickened. What curse? What did all of this mean? Before he could contemplate further, a gust of wind blew across the cemetery, knocking the vial out of his hand. It rolled across the ground, and Jacob scrambled to grab it, but it stopped at the edge of the grave. As his hand reached out to pick it up, the earth beneath him began to shift again. The ground rumbled, and suddenly a figure appeared before him. The same shadowy figure he had seen in the graveyard before, standing just beyond the shadows. This time it was clear, unmistakable. A figure of death itself, the one who had watched over the grave all these years. It spoke in a voice as cold as ice. "You've awoken it, Jacob." There is no turning back now. Jacob's heart raced in his chest as he stared at the figure before him, a shadowy outline against the deepening twilight. The chill in the air became unbearable, and the earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet as if the very ground had come alive. The figure, though formless and made of shadow, exuded an aura of imposing power, as if it had existed long before Jacob had even been born. "You've awoken it, Jacob. There is no turning back now." The figure's voice was deep, almost ancient, carrying the weight of centuries of secrets. Jacob swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What is it?" he managed to whisper, though the words came out hoarse. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the reality of the situation. He had thought he was simply grieving, trying to make sense of the impossible loss of his wife and children. But now, standing before this shadow, he realized that the truth was far darker than he had ever imagined. The figure stepped closer, the ground beneath it cracking with every movement. As it moved, the air seemed to warp, and a cold wind howled through the cemetery. Jacob could feel the energy in the air, like a weight pressing down on him. It was as if the figure itself was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. "The curse has always been here, Jacob." The voice was not just heard. It seemed to penetrate his mind, whispering into his very soul. Sarah, Eli, Noah, they were never meant to leave. This grave, this land, it was never meant to be disturbed. Jacob's mind reeled with the implications of the words. A curse? Was this all part of some dark ritual? But why? Why had his family been the ones caught in its grip? "What do you mean? What curse? Why are you here?" Jacob shouted, his voice trembling with frustration and fear. He had spent days trying to understand the strange occurrences, the voices, the eerie sensation that had gripped him since Sarah's death. But now the figure before him was speaking of something far worse, something that didn't just involve the loss of his family, it involved something far older. The figure seemed to pause as if considering Jacob's words. It stepped forward again, and with each step, the darkness around it seemed to spread, consuming the light. Jacob's breath caught as the figure's form began to take shape. It wasn't a human figure, not truly, but something ancient, a being made of shadows and whispers. The curse was placed long ago, long before you were born. The figure's voice softened, growing colder still. Your bloodline was chosen, Jacob. Your family was always meant to carry it, to protect it. Jacob took a step back, his hands trembling as he grasped the shimmering locket in his palm. The memories of his family's tragic death, the strange occurrences surrounding their graves, and the mysterious presence that had followed him came flooding back. He understood now that his family had been caught in something much larger than mere death. This wasn't just about loss. It was about something ancient, something darker than he could have ever imagined. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to do?" Jacob's voice was barely audible as the reality of the situation began to overwhelm him. The shadow figure seemed to lean in, its face still obscured by darkness. "You have already done the first part, Jacob. You found what was meant to be buried." Jacob's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" He held up the small silver locket, now resting heavily in his hands. Is this the curse? This locket? The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it waved a hand over the earth, and the ground trembled once again, as if the very cemetery itself was responding to the figure's power. Jacob felt the pull of it, the gravity of the curse beginning to consume him. It is not the locket, Jacob. The figure's voice sounded distant, as though it were fading in and out of reality. The curse is tied to your blood, to your family's blood. You have disturbed the grave of those who were meant to remain in slumber, but you can undo it if you make the right choice. Jacob's mind reeled. Undo it? How? What do I have to do? The figure paused, and for the first time, Jacob felt a flicker of something almost human from the shadow. A sadness, perhaps. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming as it stood directly in front of Jacob. The curse must be broken, Jacob. Your bloodline must make the sacrifice to release your family's souls. Only then will they be free. Jacob felt his stomach tighten as the full weight of the words settled on him. A sacrifice? What did that mean? Before he could ask more, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, the eerie wind picking up once more. You will know when the time comes, Jacob. The bloodline must pay the price. The voice faded into a distant whisper, barely audible now. Jacob stood there alone in the cemetery, the words echoing in his mind. The bloodline must pay. The ground beneath his feet rumbled once again, and the eerie light in the graveyard grew faint, like a dying star. Jacob felt the weight of the choice that lay ahead, his heart heavy with the truth he had uncovered. The curse wasn't just something from the past. It was part of him, part of his family's destiny. The question remained, what was he willing to sacrifice to set them free? The locket felt heavier in his hand, the whispers growing louder. The mystery was far from over, and Jacob knew that the truth about his family was only just beginning to unfold. The curse was alive, and it was calling him. Jacob stood motionless, the weight of the figure's cryptic words pressing down on him. The graveyard, now still once again, seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself was waiting for his next move. The shadows had receded, and the cemetery had returned to its quiet, unsettling stillness. But Jacob's mind was far from peaceful. The locket in his hand felt heavier than ever before, its cold metal pressing into his palm, as though it were alive, pulsing with some dark energy. He could still hear the whispering voices, Sarah, Eli, and Noah, their calls haunting his thoughts. But now something else had joined the chorus. The ancient force of the curse itself, a constant reminder that there was more to uncover. The bloodline must pay. The words echoed in his mind like a hammer striking a cold anvil. Sacrifice. But what did that mean? What did he have to give up in order to end this nightmare? His family's spirits, still trapped, were desperately waiting for the truth to set them free. But the cost would be more than Jacob had ever bargained for. He glanced around the cemetery once more, his gaze landing on the graves of his wife and children. The headstones, etched with their names, seemed to stare back at him. Was it worth it? Could he pay this price to free them? Or was he already too far gone? Jacob felt the tension in the air. The curse was real, and now it had a hold on him, on his family. He could sense the darkness growing around him, the invisible threads of fate pulling him closer to something that could never be undone. There was no escaping it. The wind picked up again, swirling around him in eerie patterns, and the temperature dropped. The voices grew louder, almost frantic now. Jacob could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of his decision crushing him. Jacob! Sarah's voice whispered from the shadows, soft but insistent. You have to do it. For us. For your family. Tears welled in Jacob's eyes as he clutched the locket tighter. He could hear his wife's voice, but he knew it wasn't just her. It was the curse calling to him, demanding a sacrifice. The earth trembled once more, and the shadows swirled ominously around him. What is the price? Jacob's voice was raw, pleading. He didn't want to lose anything else. He had already lost so much. But in his heart, he knew the answer. The curse wouldn't release them unless he gave something in return. The truth was before him, but it came with an unbearable cost. The locket in his hand felt hot now, as if the curse was transferring into him, consuming his very being. The sacrifice was inevitable. It had always been inevitable. He couldn't deny it any longer. Jacob closed his eyes, the whispers surrounding him like a whirlwind. His pulse thudded in his ears as he stood before the graves of his family. Knowing that the time had come, the choice was his. He had to choose between losing everything or finally setting them free. With a heavy heart and a shaking hand, Jacob made his decision. He placed the shimmering locket gently into the earth above the graves and whispered a final prayer. "I give it all." As he let the locket fall into the soil, the ground beneath him shook violently. The earth split open once more, and from the depths, a bright light emerged, illuminating the cemetery in a brilliant glow. It was as if the very earth itself had come alive, shattering the curse that had held his family's spirits captive for so long. Jacob's heart raced as the light grew brighter, consuming everything around him. The voices of Sarah, Eli, and Noah were now peaceful, their whispers fading into the air like a soft breeze. The darkness that had once clouded the cemetery began to recede, replaced by a sense of calm, of closure. The sacrifice had been made. As the light dimmed, Jacob stood alone in the cemetery, feeling the weight of what he had just done. The curse was broken. His family's spirits were finally at peace. But in exchange, Jacob had given up everything: his peace, his understanding, and most of all, his future. But as he looked around at the grave where his family had been laid to rest, Jacob knew that it was worth it. They were free now, and no matter the cost, that was the only thing that mattered. With a final lingering glance at the gravesite, Jacob turned and walked away from Crescent Hollow. He knew his life would never be the same again, but as the light of day began to break over the horizon, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, even if only for a moment.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.